The Vethkai Dominion had conquered more worlds than any species in the known galaxy could count, and they had done so through a simple belief that had never failed them. Numbers do not lie. High Commander Sir Veth stood on the observation deck of his flagship, the Eternal Calculation, watching the blue and green planet grow larger in the viewing screen before him. This world, called Earth by its inhabitants, was nothing special to his eyes. Just another primitive civilization waiting to join the long list of conquered species. "Give me the assessment," he commanded, his forearms clasped behind his back in the traditional posture of Vethkai authority. His tactical officer, a younger warrior named Telvok, stepped forward with a data tablet glowing with information. His voice carried the confidence that came from absolute certainty in their methods. "The planet holds approximately 8 billion intelligent life forms, Commander. They call themselves humans, and they have achieved only basic space travel within their own solar system. Their fastest vessels use chemical propulsion and would take thousands of years to reach the nearest star." Sirveth made a sound that served as laughter among his kind. It was almost too easy. "Continue," he ordered. "Their weapons are primitive kinetic projectiles and chemical explosives. They have developed nuclear fission but have not mastered fusion technology. Their military forces number approximately 20 million active soldiers worldwide, with another 100 million in reserve capacity." The High Commander turned to face his officer directly, all 6 of his eyes focusing with predatory interest. "And our allocated force?" 12,000 vessels carrying 890 million ground troops. This provides a ratio of approximately 7 to 1 against their total military potential, well within standard conquest parameters. The mathematics were beautiful in their simplicity, and Sirveth felt the familiar satisfaction that came before every victory. The Vethkai had refined their doctrine over 2,000 years and 2,347 successful conquests. They knew exactly how many soldiers it took to overwhelm any defense, exactly how many ships were needed to control any orbital space, exactly how much force was required to break any will to resist. Numbers did not lie, and numbers said that Earth would fall. Far across the galaxy, the humans of Earth had no idea what was coming toward them. They lived their small lives on their small world, fighting among themselves over resources and borders and ideas that seemed so important until the day their telescopes detected something that changed everything. Dr. Sarah Chun was the first to see them. She worked at an observatory in Chile and had spent 20 years searching the stars for signs of intelligent life. When the computer flagged an anomaly in the data, she assumed it was an error at first because the readings made no sense. "That cannot be right," she whispered to herself as she ran the calculations again and again. But the numbers did not change. There were thousands of objects moving in formation at speeds that broke every law of physics she understood, and they were heading directly for Earth. Within hours, the news had spread to every government on the planet. Within days, the panic had begun. People flooded churches and temples, convinced the end times had arrived. Stock markets crashed as economies collapsed under the weight of fear. Some leaders called for calm while others prepared their bunkers. In a secret facility beneath the Swiss Alps, a different kind of meeting was taking place. Here gathered the greatest military minds humanity had to offer: generals and admirals, strategists and theorists, historians who studied ancient wars, and scientists who imagined future ones. General James Morrison stood at the head of the table, a man of 70 years who had fought in 3 wars and studied 100 more. His hair was white and his hands were wrinkled, but his mind remained sharp as a blade. "We have approximately 90 days before they arrive," he said, his voice steady despite the impossible odds they faced. "Our satellites have been studying their formation and their signals. We know what they are and we can guess what they want." A younger officer raised his hand nervously. "Sir, if the estimates are correct, they outnumber us by a factor of 40 to 1. How can we possibly fight against such numbers? Morrison smiled, and it was not a pleasant smile. It was the smile of a man who had read too much history to believe that numbers alone won wars. Son, let me tell you a story. In the year 480 BCE, a Greek king named Leonidas held a narrow pass against a Persian army that outnumbered his forces by perhaps 100 to 1. He lost that battle, but the Persians paid such a terrible price that the Greeks eventually won the war. He walked around the table, meeting each pair of eyes in turn. In the jungles of Vietnam, farmers with rifles held off the most powerful military in human history. In the mountains of Afghanistan, tribal warriors fought the Soviet Union to a standstill. Throughout our history, the smaller force has found ways to defeat the larger one when they fought with intelligence and determination. But sir, another officer protested, these are aliens with technology we cannot even understand. Yes, Morrison agreed, and that is exactly why I believe we can win. The room fell silent with confusion. They have conquered thousands of worlds, the general continued. They have a system, a doctrine, a mathematical formula for victory. They look at us and see only numbers, our population, our weapons, our industrial capacity. They calculate their needs and dispatch their forces and expect us to fall like every species before us. He slammed his fist on the table. But they do not know humans. They do not know that we are the species that invented guerrilla warfare and asymmetric tactics. They do not know that every single one of our 8 billion people is capable of resistance. They do not know that we would rather burn our own world than surrender it. General Morrison looked out the window at the mountains that had protected this facility for so long. They are counting our soldiers, but they have forgotten to count our hearts, our stubborn refusal to accept defeat, our creativity and our rage and our spite. He turned back to face the assembled officers. So let them come with their millions and their mathematics. Let them believe that numbers guarantee victory. We will teach them a lesson that the universe will never forget. Across the vast darkness of space, the Vethkai Armada continued its approach toward Earth, confident in their calculations, certain of their success. They had the numbers. They had the technology. They had 2,000 years of unbroken victories. They had everything except the understanding of what it truly meant to fight a human being. The sky burned on the day the Vethkai arrived, and humanity watched in terrified silence as thousands of ships blocked out the sun over every major city on Earth. The invasion had begun exactly on schedule, exactly as the aliens had calculated. High Commander Sirveth expected the humans to attempt communication, perhaps to negotiate surrender terms or beg for mercy as so many species had done before. Instead, something unexpected happened in the first hour of contact. Every nuclear weapon on Earth launched simultaneously, but not toward the alien fleet. The missiles flew upward and detonated among humanity's own satellites, destroying in seconds the global network that had taken decades to build. What are they doing? Telvok demanded, his tactical displays suddenly filled with confusion. They have blinded themselves, another officer reported with disbelief. They have destroyed their own communication and surveillance systems. Sirveth watched the debris cloud spreading through low orbit and felt the first small seed of unease plant itself in his mind. This was not in the calculations. No species had ever destroyed its own infrastructure before a battle. It matters not, he declared, pushing aside his concerns. Proceed with the invasion as planned. Ground forces will establish control of all major population centers within 40 planetary rotations. The Vethkai landing craft descended like metal rain across 6 continents. Troops poured out by the millions, their advanced weapons cutting through human defenses with terrible efficiency. Tanks were melted, aircraft were swatted from the sky, soldiers were vaporized before they could fire a single shot. In Washington and Moscow and Beijing, the great powers of Earth fell. In London and Paris and Tokyo, ancient cities that had survived countless human wars crumbled under alien bombardment. The military bases that humanity had built with such pride became graveyards in a matter of hours. General Morrison watched the reports coming in from his bunker, and he smiled even as the numbers grew worse with every passing moment. "They are winning every battle," his aide said with tears streaming down her face. "How can you smile at a time like this?" "Because battles are not wars," Morrison replied calmly. "Let them take our cities and capture our flags. Let them believe they have won. The real war has not even started." Across the planet, the same scene repeated itself in countless variations. Human soldiers fought bravely but hopelessly against superior technology, dying by the thousands and then by the millions. Civilians fled into the countryside or cowered in their homes or were rounded up into processing centers. On the 42nd day, High Commander Sirveth stood before the cameras that would broadcast his message to every corner of Earth, declaring the planet officially conquered and its people now subjects of the Vethkai Dominion. "Your resistance was admirable but futile," he announced in translated human languages. "Your military forces have been eliminated. Your governments have surrendered. Your world now belongs to us. Accept this truth, and you will be treated fairly. Resist, and you will be destroyed." The message played on every screen still functioning, and billions of humans watched in silence as their worst fears were confirmed. But something strange happened in that silence, something the Vethkai could not understand. Occupation Commander Telvok noticed it first in the detention centers where captured human soldiers were being held. The prisoners should have been broken, defeated, despairing. Instead, many of them were smiling, laughing quietly among themselves, exchanging glances that spoke of shared secrets. "Why do they not weep?" Telvok demanded of his interrogators. "Why do they not beg?" One old soldier, a man who had fought in human wars long before the aliens arrived, looked up at the towering Vethkai officer with calm eyes. "You think you have won because you have taken our buildings and killed our armies," he said slowly. "But you do not understand what you are facing. We have not started fighting yet." Telvok struck the man across the face, but the human only laughed through his bloody lips. "Hit me again. It does not matter. Every blow you land only makes us stronger." The Vethkai officer retreated from the cell, disturbed by something he could not name. He reported the incident to High Commander Sirveth, but his superior dismissed his concerns. "They are simply too primitive to accept defeat," Sirveth explained. "It is common among less developed species. They will learn submission in time." But time did not teach humans submission. Instead, it taught the Vethkai fear. In the ruins of cities they had conquered, strange things began to happen. Patrols went missing in the night. Supply convoys were ambushed on roads that had been cleared 100 times. Weapons vanished from armories that were supposedly secure. A factory worker in Detroit named Maria Gonzalez had no military training, no weapons, no army. What she had was a mind that refused to accept defeat and a radio that still worked. She discovered that Vethkai armor had a weakness to certain sound frequencies by accident when her broken radio made one of them collapse in pain. Within a day, she had shared her discovery through a network of survivors using hidden radios and messenger runners. Within a week, every human resistance cell on the continent knew. Within a month, grandmothers were carrying modified speakers, and children were planting sonic devices near patrol routes. In Mumbai, a teenage girl named Priya Sharma used her gift for mathematics to analyze Vethkai supply movements. She created an algorithm that predicted their patterns with terrifying accuracy. And she shared it through networks that the aliens could not detect because they did not use the satellites the Vethkai were monitoring. The mesh networks grew, connecting survivors in sewers and basements and mountain caves. Humanity had destroyed their own satellites to deny the enemy intelligence, but they had not destroyed their ability to communicate. They simply did it the old way, with wires and runners and whispered messages passed from hand to hand. High Commander Sirveth received reports of increasing casualties and dismissed them as the death throes of a conquered civilization. The numbers were still acceptable. The mathematics still showed victory. But the mathematics did not account for a species where every single individual was a potential enemy. The mathematics did not account for resistance that had no headquarters to bomb and no leaders to capture. The mathematics did not account for 8 billion people who had decided that surrender was not an option. The Vethkai had conquered territory, but they had not conquered Earth. They had won every battle, but they were about to discover that humans had an entirely different definition of war. In his bunker beneath the Alps, General Morrison received word that the mesh networks were operational across 4 continents. He looked at his officers and spoke the words that would define the next chapter of human history. Tell them all. The real war begins now. The Vethkai military doctrine was a masterpiece of logic that had been refined over 2,000 years of conquest. It calculated everything: troop deployments, supply lines, civilian control ratios, pacification timelines. It had never failed because it left nothing to chance. But 6 months into the occupation of Earth, the doctrine was falling apart. Telvok stood before his superior officers, trying to explain reports that made no sense by any rational measure. His voice trembled with a fear he had never felt in his long military career. "We have lost 40,000 troops this month alone," he reported. "Not to organize military resistance, but to attacks that follow no pattern we can predict. A convoy is ambushed on a road we cleared yesterday. A supply depot explodes from devices hidden weeks ago. Soldiers simply disappear in cities we have occupied since the first day." High Commander Sirveth studied the data with growing frustration. The numbers were wrong. They had to be wrong, because if they were right, then everything he believed was wrong. How can primitives with no central command structure cause such losses? He demanded. Find their leaders and eliminate them. Destroy their bases and cut their supplies. That is the problem, Commander, Telvok replied with something like despair in his voice. There are no leaders. There are no bases. There is no structure at all. They are everywhere and nowhere. They are chaos made flesh. Across the planet, humanity had transformed into something the Vethkai could not categorize or calculate. The resistance was not an army, but a living network, constantly adapting, constantly learning, constantly sharing. In the ruins of Chicago, a mechanic named Tom Bradley figured out how to disable Vethkai vehicles using nothing but a modified car battery and some wire. He taught his neighbors, who taught their friends, who taught strangers they met while hiding from patrols. Within weeks, disabled alien vehicles littered the streets of a dozen cities. In the mountains of Peru, an old woman who had spent her life farming potatoes discovered that Vethkai rations could be contaminated with a local fungus that made the aliens violently ill. She shared her knowledge through the mesh networks, and suddenly occupation forces across South America were falling sick from food they believed was safe. A group of teenagers in Seoul figured out how to jam Vethkai communications using equipment salvaged from destroyed electronic stores. Their jamming signals spread through the underground networks and were replicated by amateur radio operators around the world. Alien forces found themselves increasingly unable to coordinate. The Vethkai responded by sending reinforcements, millions more troops to pacify a planet that should have been pacified months ago. They built more detention centers and imposed harsher punishments and burned entire neighborhoods suspected of harboring resistance. But every brutal action only created more resistance. Every execution created martyrs whose stories spread through the networks. Every destroyed home created refugees who had nothing left to lose. High Commander Sirveth sat in his command center reviewing casualty reports that grew longer every day. His mathematical models showed that Earth should have been fully pacified by now, that resistance should have collapsed under the weight of overwhelming force. Instead, resistance was growing. They do not fight like any species we have encountered, his chief analyst reported with visible confusion. They have no organized command structure, yet they coordinate attacks across continents. They have no standardized weapons, yet they develop new tactics daily. They should be broken, yet they seem to grow stronger with every defeat. Explain this, Sirveth demanded. Give me numbers I can understand. The analyst hesitated before speaking the truth that had haunted him for weeks. Commander, I cannot explain it with numbers because their strength does not come from anything we can measure. It comes from something inside them that refuses to accept defeat. They are not fighting to win in any way our doctrine recognizes. They are fighting because they cannot stop fighting. It is in their nature. In a basement in London, a group of survivors gathered around a makeshift radio to hear a broadcast that was being transmitted from somewhere in the resistance network. The voice belonged to General Morrison, still alive despite a dozen attempts on his life, still leading from his hidden bunker. My fellow humans, the old general said, his voice crackling through the static. They tell us we are defeated. They tell us resistance is hopeless. They point to their numbers and their technology and expect us to surrender. He paused, and when he continued, his voice burned with fierce determination. But they do not understand what they are fighting. They see us as statistics, as population figures in their calculations. They do not see what I see when I look at humanity. I see the mother who hides weapons beneath her children's beds. I see the factory worker who sabotages alien equipment on his night shift. I see the old man who draws maps of patrol routes and passes them to strangers. I see 8 billion people who've decided that some things matter more than survival. They cannot defeat us because we have already accepted the worst they can do. They cannot break us because we were broken the day they arrived, and we rebuilt ourselves into something harder. They cannot calculate us because we are not numbers. We are humans, and we do not surrender. The broadcast ended, but its effect rippled through the resistance like fire through dry grass. That night, attacks on Vethkai positions increased by 300% across the globe. Telvok reviewed the damage reports with hands that trembled. For the first time in his life, he wondered if the Dominion had made a terrible mistake. Commander, he asked Sirveth in a private moment, what if we cannot win this war? The High Commander turned on his subordinate with fury in all 6 of his eyes. That is impossible. We have the numbers. We have the technology. We have 2,000 years of victories. But Commander, Telvok pressed despite his fear, what if none of that matters against a species that simply refuses to lose? Sirveth had no answer, and in that silence, both officers heard something they had never heard before, the sound of Vethkai doubt. Outside, in the occupied cities and the burning countryside and the hidden tunnels beneath the earth, humanity continued to fight. Not because they believed that they could win, but because fighting was the only language they knew how to speak. The mathematics of conquest had met the mathematics of madness, and madness was winning. 1 year after the invasion, the Vethkai Dominion controlled 70% of Earth's surface. But control was a word that had lost all meaning. They held the cities, but the cities were death traps where snipers waited in every shadow. They held the farmlands, but the crops were poisoned and the wells were sabotaged. They held the roads, but every convoy was an ambush waiting to happen. They held nothing and everything at the same time. High Commander Sirveth had aged more in 12 months than in his previous 50 years of service. His confident posture had become hunched, his commanding voice had become tired, and his certainty had become something closer to desperate hope. The Dominion Council is demanding results, his communications officer reported. They want to know why pacification is taking so long. They want to know why casualty rates continue to climb. They want to know when Earth will be ready for resource extraction. Sirveth laughed bitterly at the questions. How could he explain to commanders who had never fought humans what it meant to face a species that had turned spite into a military strategy? Tell them we need more reinforcements, he ordered for the 100th time. Tell them this world is unlike any we have encountered. But the reinforcements that arrived only added to the casualty lists. Fresh troops who had never faced human resistance learned quickly that their training meant nothing against enemies who could be anyone, anywhere, at any time. In the depths of his despair, Sirveth did not notice the most dangerous thing the humans were doing. While his attention focused on the endless guerrilla war, humanity had been broadcasting. Dr. Chen, the astronomer who had first detected the invasion fleet, had survived the occupation by hiding in the mountains of Chile. She had spent months building a transmission array from salvaged parts, and now she was ready to use it. This is Earth, calling all occupied worlds of the Vethkai Dominion. She broadcast in every language the Resistance had managed to decode. We are a species called humans, and we have a message for every being who has ever lived under the boot of these conquerors. The message spread through subspace frequencies the Vethkai thought were secure. It reached worlds that had been conquered centuries ago, worlds where the memory of resistance had faded into myth. They told you that numbers guarantee victory. They told you that resistance is mathematically impossible. They told you that surrender was your only option. They lied. We are 8 billion people fighting an empire that has never lost a war, and we are winning. Not because we have better weapons or larger armies, but because we refuse to accept their mathematics. Every day we kill more of them. Every week we destroy more of their supplies. Every month their hold on our world grows weaker. They came here expecting conquest and found chaos. They expected submission and found defiance. They expected to rule and found only war. If you can hear this message, know that the Vethkai are not invincible. They can bleed. They can fail. They can be driven back. All it takes is the will to fight. Across 17 worlds, beings who had lived generations under Dominion rule heard the broadcast and remembered. They remembered ancestors who had fought before surrender. They remembered stories of resistance passed down in whispers. They remembered what it felt like to hope. On Kareth Prime, a mining world that had served the Dominion for 300 years, workers began to sabotage equipment. On Vrena 6, an agricultural planet that fed half the alien fleet, crops mysteriously failed. On Desok Station, a trading hub at the heart of Dominion space, a bomb destroyed the Central Command facility. High Commander Sirveth received the reports with disbelief that quickly turned to horror. 17 worlds? He demanded. Rebellions on 17 worlds simultaneously? 80 now, Commander. Telvok corrected with a voice that had gone flat with shock. And the reports continue to arrive. Every hour brings news of another uprising. This is impossible, Sirveth insisted, but the word had lost all meaning in his mouth. Conquered species do not rebel. The mathematics prove that resistance after pacification is futile. The humans are not following our mathematics, Telvok replied. And they are teaching others to do the same. The Dominion Council sent urgent demands. Withdraw forces from Earth to suppress the spreading rebellions. The resources spent on one primitive world were needed elsewhere. The war had grown too large for a single planet to matter. Sirveth stood on the observation deck of his flagship, looking down at the blue world that had destroyed his career and his certainty. He had come here expecting a simple conquest, a minor addition to the Dominion's long list of victories. Instead, he had found the beginning of the end. They are just primitives, he whispered to himself. How did they do this? Telvok stood beside his commander, and for once he had an answer. They did not fight to win, Commander. They fought to make us lose. They accepted that they might die, that their world might burn, that everything they loved might be destroyed. And they fought anyway, because surrender was worse than death to them. He paused before continuing with something that might have been admiration in his voice. And when they realized they could not defeat us alone, they gave the galaxy something more dangerous than any weapon. They gave them hope. They showed every conquered species that the Dominion could be challenged, could be hurt, could be humbled. We calculated their population and their industry and their military. We forgot to calculate their spite. High Commander Sirveth gave the order for withdrawal on a cold morning when snow was falling on the mountains of what humans called Switzerland. He did not call it a retreat because Vethkai doctrine had no word for retreat. He called it a strategic reallocation of forces. But every human who watched the alien ships rise into the sky knew the truth. They had faced the most powerful empire in the galaxy and had refused to kneel. They had been outgunned and outnumbered and outmatched in every way that could be measured, and they had won. General Morrison, his hair now completely white and his body worn thin by years of hiding and fighting, stood in the open air for the first time since the invasion began. Tears streamed down his weathered face as he watched the enemy flee. We did not win because we were stronger, he said to the crowd that had gathered around him. We won because we would not stop. We won because every single one of us decided that some things are worth more than survival. We won because we are humans, and humans do not surrender. The cheering that rose from that crowd spread across the planet as word of the withdrawal reached every corner of Earth. Humanity had survived. Humanity had triumphed. Humanity had changed the galaxy forever. But the war was not truly over. It had only just begun. 10 years had passed since the day the Vethkai fled from Earth, and the world had changed in ways that no one could have imagined. The scars of occupation remained visible everywhere. Cities that had stood for centuries lay in ruins. Vast stretches of farmland were still poisoned from alien weapons. Monuments and museums that had preserved human history had been reduced to rubble. The population had dropped by nearly 2 billion, lost to war and starvation and disease. But humanity had survived, and more than survived, humanity had transformed. The mesh networks that had coordinated the resistance became the foundation of a new global communication system, one that could not be controlled by any single government or corporation. Information flowed freely across borders that had once divided nations into enemies. The cooperation that had saved humanity became the principle that would guide its future. Technologies born from desperation revolutionized every aspect of life. The sonic weapons that had crippled Vethkai armor became medical devices that healed wounds and cured diseases. The jamming systems that had disrupted alien communications became the basis for new forms of instantaneous messaging. The survival techniques that had kept resistance fighters alive in the wilderness became solutions for hunger and poverty. General Morrison had not lived to see the anniversary. He had died 3 years after liberation, his body finally giving out after decades of stress and sacrifice. But his words lived on, inscribed on monuments in every city on Earth. They counted our weapons. They counted our soldiers. They forgot to count our hearts. Diar Chun had become something of a legend, the woman whose broadcasts had ignited rebellions across the galaxy. She now led Earth's first interstellar communication initiative, reaching out to the worlds that had risen up alongside humanity. On this 10th anniversary, she stood before the United Earth Council in a chamber that had been built from the wreckage of a dozen destroyed capitals. Representatives from every nation sat in attendance, but the room also held visitors who would have been unimaginable a generation ago. Aliens from 17 different species had made the journey to Earth. Beings who had once served the Vethkai Dominion and had found freedom because of humanity's example. They came not to offer aid or establish treaties, but to ask a single question. "How did you do it?" asked the Karathi delegate, a being of crystalline structure but caught the light in beautiful patterns. "How did your species resist when all mathematics said resistance was impossible?" Chun smiled at the question she had heard so many times before. "There is no secret," she replied. "There is no special technique or hidden weapon. We simply refuse to accept their math." The delegates murmured among themselves in confusion, and Chun continued. "The Vethkai believed that conquest was a science, that victory could be calculated like an equation. They looked at our population and our weapons and our industry, and they assigned numbers to everything they saw. But they could not assign a number to the one thing that truly matters." She gestured to a wall where photographs had been placed, images from the occupation, showing ordinary humans in extraordinary moments of courage. A mother hiding supplies under her children's beds. An old man drawing maps for strangers. Teenagers building radio equipment from garbage. A billion small acts of defiance that had added up to something the Dominion had never faced. They could not calculate our stubbornness. They could not calculate our creativity. They could not calculate our willingness to sacrifice everything for the chance that our children might be free. These things have no numbers, but they are the most powerful forces in the universe. The Karathi delegate leaned forward with something like hunger in its crystalline eyes. "But how do we teach our people to find this strength? How do we show them what you showed the galaxy?" Chun thought for a long moment before answering. "You do not teach it. You remember it. Every species that has ever existed has had to fight for survival at some point in their history. The Vethkai tried to make you forget, tried to convince you that submission was natural and resistance was foolish. But the truth is that the will to fight is never truly lost, only buried." She pointed to the alien delegates one by one. "Your ancestors resisted before they were conquered. Your grandparents told stories of heroes, even when telling such stories was punished. Your children dream of freedom even when they have never known it. We did not give you anything you did not already have. We simply reminded you that it was there." News came that day from the far edges of what had once been Dominion space. The Vethkai Empire had collapsed, torn apart by rebellions it could not suppress and internal conflicts it could not resolve. The mathematical certainty that had guided 2,000 years of conquest had failed utterly when faced with the chaos of hope. High Commander Sirvith had been executed by his own people, blamed for the disaster that began with his invasion of Earth. Telvok had defected to the rebellion, eventually becoming an advocate for peace between species. The Eternal Calculation, the flagship that had carried such certainty to Earth, had been captured by former slaves and turned into a memorial for all those who had died under Dominion rule. But the true legacy of humanity's resistance was not measured in fallen empires or liberated worlds. It was measured in the minds that had changed forever. Across the galaxy, beings of every shape and nature looked at the universe differently because of what humans had done. They no longer believed that power guaranteed victory or that numbers determined fate. They had learned that the smallest species could humble the mightiest empire if they simply refused to surrender. A monument was unveiled on the 10th anniversary, a simple stone marker placed at the site of the Swiss bunker where humanity's resistance had been planned. The inscription was brief, but it carried a weight that no amount of words could express. Here, humanity decided that some things matter more than survival. Here, we learned that the mathematics of conquest cannot calculate the value of a free heart. Here, we chose to fight not because we knew we could win, but because surrender was unthinkable. To all who come after us, remember, they will count your weapons and your soldiers and your cities. They will calculate their victory with absolute certainty. They will tell you the resistance is mathematically impossible. Prove them wrong. Visitors came from every corner of Earth, and eventually from every corner of the galaxy, to read those words. They came to remember and to be inspired, to touch the stone that marked the place where everything had changed. And in the quiet of the mountain night, when the visitors had gone and the monument stood alone beneath the stars, the wind carried a whisper that might have been imagination or might have been something more. It was the voice of 8 billion people who had refused to be calculated. A species that had looked at impossible odds and decided to fight anyway. A small blue world that had taught the universe the most important lesson of all. Numbers do not determine fate. Will does. Spite does. Love does. Hope does. The Vethkai had counted everything they could see, but they had forgotten to count the one variable that truly mattered. They forgot to count the human spirit, and it had cost them everything.